The night held a strange stillness, the kind that settles over Los Angeles only when the studios sleep and the last limousine has disappeared into the dark. The Hollywood backlot, usually alive with barking directors, running crew members, and 1,000 footsteps, had become a skeleton of wooden facades and painted illusions. Its streets echoed only with the hum of distant generators and the faint rustle of a warm breeze threading through fake alleyways. Marilyn Monroe stepped out of her dressing room, coat wrapped tightly around her shoulders. The studio had offered her a car hours earlier, but she had declined. She liked walking alone on the empty lot after long days, liked the strange piece of sets stripped of people and pretenses. Her heels tapped softly along the cobblestones of a European village set that belonged to some half-finished romance film. Lamps without bulbs hung above her, and storefront windows reflected nothing but the pale glow of the moon. She paused halfway down the street, rubbing her eyes. She was tired in the way that seeped into her bones, tired in the way that no bath, no laughter, no applause could wash away. She turned, trying to remember if she had left the annotated script in her dressing room or the props office earlier. It didn't matter. She would look again tomorrow. But as she reached the corner of the soundstage, a flicker of orange appeared in the distance. It was faint at first, almost unnoticeable, just a soft pulse behind the old Victorian facade at the far end of the backlot, the one used for thrillers and ghost stories. Marilyn slowed her steps, watching the glow shift and quiver. A trick of light, she told herself. A stage lamp left on, a reflection on a window. Then she heard it, a sharp snap like wood breaking under pressure. The glow deepened. Something in her chest tightened. She walked toward it without thinking, every sense sharpening, every instinct reaching for meaning. The air grew warmer with every step. The sky above the backlot shimmered, as though a silent creature had exhaled heat into the night. By the time she reached the New York Street set, a long corridor of wooden storefronts and false brick walls, the glow had turned into a steady, breathing shimmer of firelight. Then the first plume of smoke rose. No alarms sounded. No guards rushed in. No bells clanged. Just smoke, dark, silent, curling upward from between the cracks of a boarded-up door. Marilyn froze, her heartbeat thundering in her ears. She knew these buildings were old, dry, delicate. She had spent years walking through their hollow rooms, brushing past their splintering frames, breathing in the dust that gathered in their corners. They were not meant for real heat. They were meant to mimic danger, not endure it. And smoke meant someone might still be inside. Every sound deepened, the crackling inside the walls, the subtle groans of beams warming under pressure, the faint whistle of air being pulled through narrow spaces as fire fed itself. The building vibrated gently, as though waking from a deep sleep into slow, devastating panic. Marilyn stepped forward. Another snap echoed, louder this time, closer to a scream than a crack. Inside the building, something shifted. A shadow fell across one of the upper windows, a shape, small and unsteady, collapsing against the glass before disappearing from sight. Marilyn's breath caught in her throat. She wasn't certain, not entirely, but she thought she saw an arm, a leg, the outline of a person sinking to the floor. The costuming department often worked late. Seamstresses stitched until dawn. Carpenters repaired props. Young assistants, barely paid and barely seen, cleaned after every production. Someone had been left behind. Marilyn didn't shout, didn't panic, didn't run for help. There was no time. The fire was inside already, burning quietly like a secret trying to stay hidden. But secrets always grew, and this one was growing fast. She pressed her hand to the doorknob. It was warm, too warm. The wood beneath her palm trembled. Smoke seeped through the gaps around the frame. Her eyes strung. Her skin flushed. Her breath shook. But she kept her grip steady. Her coat hung heavy around her shoulders. She shrugged it off, letting it fall to the floor. Her dress clung lightly to her body, airy enough to move, but even she knew the fabric would be no protection from flame. That didn't matter. What mattered was that someone was in there, surrounded by a rising tide of heat and smoke, with no one else aware of the danger. The backlot was nearly deserted. The few guards stationed near the entrance gates were too far to see the fire building inside the hollow walls of this old set. So she made her decision, quietly, firmly, without hesitation. She pushed the door open. A swell of hot air rushed out at her, hitting her face and chest like the breath of a wild animal. The hallway inside glowed orange along the floorboards, shadows flickering like frantic hands reaching for escape. Marilyn stepped in. Smoke coiled around her, thick and bitter. She pulled her sleeve over her nose, eyes narrowing against the sting. The hallway stretched ahead, dark but trembling with the heartbeat of growing flames. The walls radiated heat. The carpet was hot beneath her shoes. The air felt alive, pulsing with danger. Somewhere deeper inside, wood cracked. Somewhere above her, something heavy fell. The fire wasn't at full strength yet, but it was spreading with hunger. She moved quickly, almost running, pushing past collapsing costume racks, scattered props, fallen mannequins. The old loft where seamstresses worked was toward the back, up a narrow flight of stairs that creaked under normal conditions. Now the steps hissed and groaned under her weight. At the top, she found the source of the shadow she had glimpsed from outside. A young costumer lay slumped near a rack of dresses, his hand still curled around a bundle of fabric, as though he had tried to carry something to safety before losing consciousness. His face was pale beneath soot and sweat, his chest rising in shallow, uneven breaths. Marilyn knelt beside him. Smoke burned her throat, but she forced herself to breathe through her sleeve. Her hands shook as she pulled him upright, looping his arm around her shoulder. He was heavier than she expected, dead weight softened by exhaustion and heat. She braced her legs, dug her heels into the floor and pulled. The first real flames reached the loft. They burst from beneath the stairs, climbing upward like liquid fire, licking at the wooden beams and swallowing the old costumes hanging from racks. Marilyn didn't look at them. She knew that looking would slow her, weaken her, make her hesitate. And there was no room for hesitation. She pulled the unconscious man toward the stairs, dragging him inch by inch across the scorched floorboards. The fabric of her dress clung to her skin, damp with sweat. Her hair stuck to her cheeks. Each breath felt like inhaling gravel and smoke. Outside, the night remained silent. No help was coming. The fire grew louder, faster, hungrier. Marilyn tightened her grip on the man and kept dragging him forward. She didn't care if the flames reached her. She didn't care if her dress burned. She didn't care if no one ever learned what she had done. She cared only that he lived. Because someone had to walk into the fire. And tonight that someone was her. The stairs groaned beneath her as she dragged the man downward, each step trembling with the pressure of heat seeping through the wood. The flame beneath the loft had begun to spread with frightening speed, racing along the underside of the staircase. A crack split the air as a board burst, sending embers showering through the gaps like sparks from a forging hammer. Marilyn shielded the man with her shoulder, lowering herself and keeping him close to the ground where the air was faintly cleaner. The descent felt endless. Every inch of railing burned hot under her palm. Every breath scraped through her throat like sand and smoke. Her eyes watered until the world blurred into streaks of firelight and shadows. But she kept moving, her heartbeat pounding against her ribs, her muscles trembling under the weight she refused to abandon. When she finally reached the bottom of the stairs, a beam crashed behind her, splitting into smouldering fragments that rolled toward her feet. She didn't look back. The entire loft above groaned under the pressure of the growing flames, threatening collapse. She pulled the man across the narrow hallway, navigating around collapsing mannequins, overturned sewing machines, and scattered rolls of fabric igniting like torches. Heat pressed against her from all sides, squeezing her lungs and drying her mouth until she tasted metal and ash. The hallway that had once felt claustrophobic in its darkness was now too bright, illuminated by a growing inferno that threw sharp shadows against the walls. Old wooden panels blistered and curled, paint cracking into curling flakes that drifted in the hot air like burning leaves. The costumes hanging along the walls caught fire one by one, each dress turning into a column of dancing flame that reached upward with frantic hunger. Marilyn braced her shoulder under the man's arm and hoisted him higher. Her legs shook from carrying his weight, but she ground her feet into the scorching floorboards, pushing forward with a determination born of something deeper than instinct. Her skin prickled with heat, her breath thinned, sweat rolled down her neck, evaporating instantly. The fire was beginning to roar now, no longer a secret, no longer patient. It surged through the set as if reclaiming its domain. Walls trembled beneath the force of the blaze, and the ceiling rattled in warning. The old backlot had been built like a theatre backdrop, never meant to withstand real disaster. Everything here was fragile, assembled with nails and hope rather than stone and metal. Marilyn felt it shifting around her, the entire structure responding to the wild heat. She needed to move faster. She pulled the man into the wardrobe corridor, where rows of costumes hung on metal racks that trembled with heat. Fabric smoldered at the edges, releasing plumes of black smoke that twisted through the air in swirling shapes. Props scattered on the floor melted into unrecognizable lumps. The air tasted like burnt cotton and old wood. Her body screamed for rest, her arms numb, her shoulders sharp with pain, but she did not slow. She pressed forward with a stubborn, unyielding resolve that had carried her through studios, photographers, endless expectations. But this was different. This wasn't a performance. It wasn't a staged fire or a dramatic rescue written in a script. It was real in a way that stripped everything else from her mind. She reached the end of the hallway where the door they had entered through still stood half open. Smoke poured through the gap in thick waves. Flames crawled along the walls and ceiling, chasing her like wild animals, hungry and relentless. The door frame collapsed inward. The exit was blocked. Marilyn stumbled backward, her chest tightening as the fire consumed what little hope the doorway had offered. A wooden beam crashed down across the floor in front of her, sending sparks exploding outward like a spray of molten stars. The flames leapt higher, swallowing the opening in a solid wall of heat. There was no way out through the front. Her heartbeat stuttered in her ears for a single moment, a flash of fear, sharp and cold. Smoke pressed against her lungs, leaving only thin threads of air to breathe. She looked down at the man slumped beside her, unmoving, helpless, his breaths shallow and inconsistent. She could leave him. She could save herself. She could run back up the stairs and try to find another exit, or she could flee into one of the side hallways and hope the fire hadn't reached them yet. But she didn't move. Instead, she tightened her grip around his chest, her arms trembling but still strong enough to lift. She searched the hallway, blinking against the smoke as she forced her eyes to find a path, any path. There is a narrow maintenance door near the back wall, half concealed behind a fallen dress form. She had never noticed it before. It was unpainted, plain, almost invisible among the elaborate set pieces, likely a small service entrance used by carpenters and maintenance staff. If it led to the exterior wall of the set, it might open onto the alley behind the New York street. Or it might open into storage. Or another hallway. Or nowhere at all. But it was the only chance they had. She dragged the man across the floor, her legs buckling under the strain. The heat was worse here, trapped between rows of metal racks that radiated like ovens. Her skin felt raw, sensitive to the slightest touch of hot air. She kept going, her breath coming in ragged bursts. Flames chased them from behind, devouring the wooden floorboards as though tasting the path she had taken. Marilyn reached the maintenance door and kicked aside the fallen dress form. Her hands trembled violently as she reached for the handle. It was hot, scalding, but she forced her grip around it, teeth clenched, ignoring the pain burning into her palms. She twisted. The latch resisted. She twisted harder. The latch snapped with a sharp metallic cry. The door slid open. Darkness greeted her, cooler than the inferno behind her. A narrow, unlit passageway stretched ahead, lined with exposed beams, electrical boxes, and storage crates. The air was breathable, cool enough to sting her overheated lungs. She nearly collapsed in relief, but she caught herself, remembering the man at her side. She pulled him into the darkness, dragging him past the threshold as the flames surged behind them. The moment their bodies fully cleared the doorway, the fire lunged into the maintenance hall, swallowing the space where they had stood just seconds earlier. Marilyn pushed the door shut. The metal warped under heat, bending inward as the wood behind it ignited, but it held for now. She pressed her forehead against the cool wall, her body shaking with exhaustion. Sweat rolled down her temples, mixing with soot that smeared across her cheeks. Her breath came too fast, too shallow, each inhale burning her throat with the memory of smoke. But she didn't stop. The man needed to be carried through the narrow passage, out toward whatever exit lay ahead. She didn't know how long the fire would take to reach this hallway. She didn't know if the ceiling here would hold. She didn't know if the door at the far end was locked or blocked, or if it even existed. But certainty had no place here. Only forward. Marilyn lifted him again, her arms trembling, and began moving deeper into the narrow corridor, away from the blaze. away from the collapsing set, away from the world that would never know how close the night had come to swallowing them both whole. The fire roared behind her, muffled but relentless, creeping closer with every heartbeat. She kept walking, because running wasn't possible. Stopping wasn't an option, and looking back would only slow her down. The maintenance corridor stretched longer than it had any right to be, a narrow artery running behind the polished illusion of the studio's New York street. Marilyn forced her feet forward along the concrete floor, feeling each muscle protest the weight she supported. Her arms burned. Her back shrieked with every step. Her breath came in shallow draws, each one rasping through her chest like sandpaper. But the man in her grasp was breathing, however faintly, chest rising and falling in thin, fragile motions that kept her going. He had no strength to walk, no strength to speak. She could only hope his consciousness still lingered somewhere behind his soot-darkened eyelids. The corridor dimmed as she travelled deeper, the lone bulbs above flickering with sickly yellow light. Dust coated every surface. Abandoned crates leaned against the walls, marked with years-old labels from bygone productions. The fire raged behind the door she had sealed, its muffled roars echoing through the narrow space like the low growl of a cornered animal. Marilyn felt its heat even here, creeping beneath the metal door, slithering along the floor and walls in invisible ripples. It travelled with them, trailing them like a shadow of the blaze they had escaped. She had no sense of time. Minutes stretched into something elastic and uncertain. Her body moved on instinct, on necessity, on the last threads of will that clung stubbornly to her. The passage ahead remained dim, unchanged, almost unending. Then she noticed it, a faint draft brushing against her face. Cool, clean, alive. She kept moving, following the touch of fresh air like a thread pulling her forward. The corridor curved slightly, and as she rounded the turn, she saw it. A door at the far end, metal and rusted, with a sliver of night peeking through its lower edge. Marilyn steadied herself against the wall. Relief washed over her, but it didn't lighten her muscles or ease the ache twisting through her back. It simply sharpened her focus. The fire behind them cracked sharply, something heavy giving way. The vibrations echoed through the concrete floor. The narrow passageway trembled, dust falling from overhead beams. The blaze had reached the maintenance hall. She tightened her hold around the unconscious man and pressed forward, faster now, unsteady but determined. The air grew cooler. The touch of night strengthened. The faint pulse of the outside world beckoned through that rusted metal door, like the promise of life she had not dared to imagine while trapped in the inferno. Her hand reached the handle. Cold. She wrapped her fingers around it, savouring the sensation before pulling downward and forcing the door open with the last momentum her body held. Night air swept into the corridor, carrying the smell of damp asphalt and distant city lights. The moon hung above the backlot, pale and ghost-like. It cast faint reflections into the alley behind the studio, an expanse of cracked pavement bordered by chain-link fence and towering shadows of warehouses. The cool air hit her lungs like a shock, sharp and cleansing. She gasped involuntarily, drawing in breaths that strung and soothed at the same time. She pulled the unconscious man onto the pavement and lowered him carefully against the wall. Her arms gave out the moment he was settled, muscles collapsing from sheer exhaustion. She let herself sit beside him, leaning her soot-covered head against the cold brick, chest heaving. The fire behind the door roared louder now. Smoke billowed from the cracks, leaking into the alley in dark, writhing clouds. The studio backlot glowed faintly orange as flames pressed against the interior structure. Marilyn looked at the man beside her. His breathing was still shallow but steadier. His chest rose and fell with fragile persistence. She wiped ash gently from his forehead with a trembling hand. He was alive because she had walked through fire to bring him here. Sirens wailed faintly in the distance. Lights flared over the rooftops, first blue, then red, then the white glare of studio security rushing toward the backlot. The calm night was rapidly dissolving into chaos. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the cool air flow over her sweat-streaked skin. Her chest still hurt with every inhale, but she breathed deeper anyway, savouring each lungful of oxygen like something precious. The door behind them rattled violently. Then it burst outward. Flames surged into the alley in a wild eruption, blasting heat across the pavement. Marilyn flinched, instinctively shielding the man with her body, though the immediate danger had already passed. A plume of embers rose into the sky like a swarm of fireflies fleeing the collapse. The studio wall, never meant to withstand this, began to buckle. Beams inside groaned, snapping one by one with thunderous cracks that echoed through the backlot. The set she had walked into, its rooms, its costumes, its illusions, began to crumble inward as the inferno consumed its foundation. Security guards shouted from a distance, frozen for a moment by the shock of seeing her there, covered in soot, illuminated by firelight. The entire backlot trembled as a final cascade of wooden frames surrendered into the flames. Marilyn watched the collapse in silence. Not as an actress, not as a celebrity, not as a myth, but as a woman who had walked directly into danger without hesitation. She felt the weight of it in her bones, what she had done, what she had risked, what she had refused to walk away from. The world would never know, reporters would never hear of it, studios would bury the incident in paperwork and silence. The story of her walking into fire to save another human being would vanish in the smoke rising above the ruined set. But she knew, and the man she had saved, if he recovered, would carry the truth in his memory, even if no one else ever did. The first responders reached them, kneeling around the unconscious man, checking his vitals, preparing a stretcher. One of them wrapped a blanket around Marilyn's shoulders, but she hardly felt it. Her body was numb, her breath still uneven, her heartbeat slow and heavy with exhaustion. She watched as they lifted the man carefully, securing him and carrying him toward the waiting ambulance. The bright white lights flashed across her face, revealing the streaks of soot, the burned edges of her costume, the raw redness of her palms where the door handle had scorched her skin. But there was something else in her expression, something deeper than fatigue or shock. A quiet, unwavering resolve. A fire that no flame could burn away. As the responders moved around her, one of them paused long enough to look at her with a mixture of awe and confusion. They didn't ask questions, they simply didn't know where to begin. She rose slowly to her feet, using the wall for support as her legs adjusted to standing again. The night air filled her lungs, cool and steady. The ruined set behind her collapsed one final time, sending sparks drifting upward like a silent salute. Marilyn stepped forward, her body aching but her spine straight, her chin lifted despite the soot streaking her face. She walked across the alley, not toward the crowd gathering near the studio, not toward the cluster of shocked staff whose voices rose in chaotic waves. She walked toward the shadows, toward quiet, toward a place where her heartbeat could settle and her hands could stop shaking, where she could exist not as the icon cameras expected, but as the woman who had faced a nightmare and refused to turn away. No headlines would speak of her courage. No papers would print the truth. No photograph would capture the moment she carried a man from flames. But the night itself remembered, and somewhere deep in the ruins, beneath the charred frame of a forgotten set, there remained the path she had carved through the fire, marked not by footprints but by the sheer force of her will. A story the newspapers buried. A truth the world was never meant to see. A moment that belonged only to the flames, the night, and the heart of Marilyn Monroe. And in the quiet after the inferno, that was enough.